Господа, добрый день.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We open the afternoon panel discussion at this excellent forum. I'm Mikhail Fishman, a journalist from Russia, and I shall moderate this session as well as the next one. I will be moderating it. To begin with, two announcements about the format of our conversation. Well, first of all, regrettably, the fourth panelist could not join us, Kirill Rogov, much to our regret, an old friend of the school, a well-known Russia's publicist, political analyst, and which is very important for us, but because of his health problems, he couldn't do it, and we'll have to try to work it out without him. Nevertheless, the three other panelists are here with us, and I suggest we should work along these lines. First, to each of our distinguished guests, I'll give them the floor, not for long though, and then we shall all of us join this discussion. I urge you to take part in this discussion. At that, please do not forget the presentations we had before. Of course, they should remain the focus of your and our attention in part of our general work. Well, so much for our session we're about to have now. Well, as you can see, you see participants from Russia, a well-known Russia's researchers, journalists, sociologists, and it is just for good reason. We will begin a general conversation, but we'll begin this conversation with conversation about Russia. It has to do with what the school, it was born in Russia, and with the fact that Russia today is the focus of many processes that we have been discussing here. And let me begin by saying a couple of words. Why I think it matters. Well, it is part of this general conversation we have been having. I just noted, all of us may have noted, that the school has changed its name. It no longer is known as the School for Political Studies. It is now known as the School for Civic Enlightenment. It's just my guess. I may just make a guess, but I interpret it in a way that because politics, what originally the school said it would go for, in Russia it has undergone change in the last 25 years, and for that matter, Russia and the school are the same age, but the paths went separate ways, but in politics it's there, yes, of course, political life, it's too much of it, but the society is no longer part of it. It's not taking any part in it, and it's maybe my understanding, but I may be wrong, but this is what I feel about this. At this time, the school realized that there's something wrong with this name, because the school and its focus of this attention is all about society, and has always been the case. And at the time when the society stopped being part of political process, the question was, are we known by the right name? Hence the name School of Civic Enlightenment, and it is for good reason, because the word civic is the key here, and surely it's we are, as part of the school, we are thinking that the society should build democracy and institutions. This is what it is. The power, the authorities will never be able to cope with this if they undertake it instead of the society. And in point of fact, Russia's history in the last 35 years is a good example of these attempts that failed when somebody wants to do something instead of the society, to build a life along these lines, and what it all ends in. This is where we switch to today's panel. It so happened, it is just accidental coincidence that I looked in Russia's history, in the 1990s history, and as I went to the archives and I spoke to the people who worked then, the question was, how could it happen, where and why, and how the democratic process and project started in Russia in 1991 when the school arose, when everybody looked at that into this new future. And as we traveled a certain distance, we found ourselves where we are now. And as Robert Skidulski just put it in his remarkable presentation, we cannot even find the common name, generic name. I dislike the word Putinism. I do not want to use this term, but nevertheless, I also realize that we are short of terms, but we realize it's something opposite to what we started moving towards back then in 1991. And where was that bifurcation point? How could it happen? And it became clear that this question falls into many smaller questions. They're not really small. They are very important questions, but at which point of time the information and the conversation turns into manipulation and propaganda, and that post-truth and fake news we have been discussing today. Can you divide this line between the one and the other? At which time the majority becomes a rubber stamp parliament, majority in parliament, and where do we hold this dividing line? At which time the election turns into its own imitation? And there are a number of questions. If we speak about what happened to Russia and to Russia's society in the last 25 years, and I understand it. And as I was looking for answers to these questions, I realized there's no such thing as this bifurcation point where you think things turned one way or another, as in the excellent film Back to the Future. There's no such thing, but in the center of all this drama, if you will, is all about problem of trust, which today was discussed by Yuri Senakosov and Lena Nemirovskaya. Exactly, it is the crisis of trust, where people all of a sudden, it turns out they cannot reach an agreement or cannot come to terms to each other, and then they stop confiding in the government, stop believing then I cannot trust a deputy or other. This is all about the trust. We find ourselves in a situation where I, as a citizen, seem to be posing a problem, which is absolute nonsense in terms of the common unity of goals we'll started with. So to me, it's a question about trust. So I believe it's very logical and reasonable if we should begin this conversation as we look back and maybe an attempt to find an answer what didn't work back then and why. And I would like to give the floor to Lev Dmitrievich Gudkov, chief of Levada Center, who will give us like a keynote address on this. Well, I am not going to deliver any presentation. What I want to do is I want to draw your attention on some things so that we could start the discussion, some just talking points. I suppose the most important thing about this is to start a discussion. I think that in the last week, as we track the processes which took place in Russia and in the post-Soviet space and in the countries of Eastern Europe for some 30 years, since 1988, and the moods then were euphoric because of the reforms that started, which were very soon to be replaced by doubts and caution, something that was sensed back by the 1990s, especially during the second, after the beginning of the first Chechen War and a second re-election of Yeltsin. It instead was replaced by doubts and the feeling that the country was moving reverse towards back. I'd like to say that not that this resentment and resistance is still there, but what I would want to say is not so much say any words of reproach, or I don't want to seek the ones to blame. I just want to focus maybe to place some accents about these, about these hazardous sort of ideas, grounds, and maybe raise some questions we could discuss. What I want to say that in the 26 years of post-Soviet Russia, 18 years, Russia has been waging a war. 5 wars. 2 Chechen wars. One of them lasted 9 years, the other 4 years. Russo-German war, the war in Donbass, and today's intervention in Syria. This is the background which lays sort of the picture, and this couldn't but tell on the government structure, on the economy, on public opinion, and whatever. To begin with, what is trust? From sociology viewpoint, trust is a kind of, when you are sure that your partner, be it an individual, a group, or an institution, would behave to live up to your expectations. It's clear that the reason for these expectations could be different. We believe in different, we trust in our physicians or family members, or a politician, or a priest, or a scientist is one or other way to trust, or say when we buy a ticket online for some airline ticket. It's all kinds of different trusts, but it's still the same thing. Trust rises pretty late as a problem. One of the first to describe were the German sociologists. It was here in Berlin, I want to underline that, because the very first research on moral grounds for trust were analyzed and described by Georg Simmel, as he discussed the spiritual life in a city that where he actually implied Berlin. And generally speaking, German philosophers and sociologists really paid great attention to that, because they could see with their own eyes how fast social differentiation was happening at the time. And Simmel was the first to write a piece of work on moral grounds of social differentiation, because in this sophisticated society, this is where we see this phenomenon rising, this trust. That is why problems of trust are immediately linked to very rapidly evolving social differentiation, rapidly evolving society that becomes more and more complex, and the rise of individuals who have to make a choice and find their ways in this society getting more and more sophisticated. If we recall Max Weber, he was saying that modern capitalism and modern society bring together 2 impulses: rational law, rational entrepreneurship, science, research, technologies, and methodological control over one's own life, which was the basis of Protestantism. All of it together gives rise to the situation of trust, to the rise of trust. If we look at it from that perspective, it's clear that trust in political figures may have very different grounds. This is both symbolic identity, where a leader represents certain collective values and symbolizes group or national identity. This is where we see our hopes laid on this leader under the spell of illusion that he would pursue a certain policy. These are our political expectations, and quite rational design on where we want to avoid the threats or hazards of conformity when we want to join the supposed majority. All these are very sophisticated phenomena that are coming to live in a very sophisticated, disintegrating society. In the terms of Soviet Union, nobody ever thought of dreamt of thinking about trust for the state, trust for the party, because it was clear that the main survival strategy for the majority of the population, and the way we described it, and we did it almost at the very final days of the Soviet Union, that was all about adaptation, trying to get to adapt towards a repressive state. Hence the dual conscience that is known as doublethink. There's doublethink where we combines demonstrative loyalty and lack of respect for this government. This is the way of adaptation where there is no question about trust. Trust is something that rose in post-Soviet times. And this is where what was most important. What happened to that trust? Mass trust, enthusiastic trust in 1988 to 1999, 1991, very soon would be laid in the leaders of a new democratic movement, and it was linked to that, but was not accompanied by a citizen's own activity in support of these leaders. They are two very important things. In fact, we got some kind of transformed structure of where we see transfer, a kind of illusions of the state paternalism or socialism with a human face at the first stage originally, which in the long run did not imply one's own involvement. Hopes for a rapid miracle where we would get out of the crisis were all laid in leaders of reform and so what. But it turned out that that is quite a strong trap. And to cut this long story short, I will give you a quotation from one of the articles by Trudolyubov. He wrote about lost illusions of the times of perestroika. The lost illusions of perestroika years and these semi-reform convulsions, it's not like of this a disappointment, it's just an indicator of this failure of elitist, quasi-democratic structure that worked as the driver of public change. The reform, those who pursued the reforms had enjoyed maximum support in this harshest times, 1992, but didn't want to convert this trust system into civic organizations and normally working institutions. Well, my objective is not about reproaching anybody, it just rather raises a question for the future, including for the work of the school, as we seek to identify the program for further development. It seems to me that if you look into the future, the school should pay attention to this modification of Soviet ideas which are resurfacing again, because we are dealing with the restoration of Soviet concepts. Again, it's a kind of recurrence of totalitarian trends. If we imply, and when we say totalitarianism, not necessarily gulag, but a syndrome, what Brzezinski described as totalitarian syndrome, a possibility to do comparative research and analysis in different regimes. And in this way, under the syndrome, they imply artificially created figure of a national leader with charisma, be it President Putin or Castro or whoever. This is the dominance of political police, which is there. This is a great presence of the state in economy, or subjugation of economy to militaristic goals. Remember that in the late 1990s, the state controlled 26 to 27% of assets in the country, but today's economists say it's over 71. These figures, well, you could debate about the exact figures, but the very fact that we see monopoly of the state over economy, it's a fact. And the economy serves to mostly military, political and police functions. It is a fact. You must look at the Russian Federation budget to understand that expenses on law enforcement, on army, on defense are 3 to 5 times higher than whatever goes to pay for social services and welfare. This is important. Third aspect I wish to raise in my presentation is this is a process, of course, of this changing structure and initiators of the reform. That is when the reform was intercepted, when they would be more and more subjugated. If the reforms are pursued by the bureaucracy, it certainly pursues its own goals and uses its own instruments of policy. And in the long run, all these reforms boil down to the interests that of the bureaucracy per se. And this is what we see, despite all efforts, and which are indeed there, of politicians who seek to pursue democratic reform. As Putin came to power, it all has been undergoing change and has been subjugated to very different goals and objectives. Simpler to say, what Putin began with. Putin started with gaining control over mass media, monopolization of television, which would be subject to censorship, and we see that this sphere is almost completely controlled by presidential administration. Mass media turned into a weapon of very powerful and very effective propaganda, for once. Secondly, well, I spoke about the war. It is ongoing war. The return to Soviet ideas and concepts that use all the syndromes of an irritated mind, of a poor society. They really lived a very hard life in the 1990s. But let me get back to the situation of the 1990s. The revolution from this top-down approach. Indeed, no matter what idealistic objectives it may have been pursuing, in this or other way, it had to rely upon the dominance, political technology. And speaking of the late 1990s, when the government was changed and when the people who pursued reforms, the so-called reformers, were removed from power, therefore this technology undergoes change. The most important thing that happens at the time is refusal to represent the interests of different classes and strata of society, indeed, who were very much deprived and disadvantaged in the times and don't have a possibility to represent their interests in the public space. And this gradual concentration and focus of public field, when it gets more and more, if you will, it begins to shrink like shark skin. It is something we're really have been perceiving since the mid-2000s, and in 2010 they turned towards confrontation with the West, beginning with Putin's speech in Munich.
And in this situation, we are dealing with the change of the tide, the change in the public consciousness and the general discourse in Russia. In the beginning of the 90s, about 60% of those polled had unexpressed a wish to become a part of the United Europe, which is hardly possible to conceive. About 40% of those polled in the beginning of the 90s would have welcomed Russia's accession to NATO, which was something which is, of course, hard to imagine today. So there was not much anti-Western sentiment, as indeed the sense of the historical impasse. There was even an almost masochistic feeling of inferiority, and the unification with the West, alongside with the adoption of the universal values, was viewed by many as the only way for Russia to move forward. Well, to an extent, there is still an ideal in Russia among the people, some people, an ideal mental image of the West. And however, it has certainly gone much deeper in the people's consciousness, and what we're seeing in return is a very massive and indeed quite successful propaganda, which has led to the discourse of confrontation with the West, which has gone up twice, specifically during the military conflict in Georgia in 2008 and during the Ukrainian crisis. So when we take into account, as Professor Minakov has said, one should take into account this presumption of guilt, and this is an important thing. The repression on the part of the Kremlin is a consistent policy of historical ties. It is a sterilization of the civil society, and it is only the civil society which would have been in a position to prevent Russian society fragmentation. So this has to be taken as a fact. And so to us, as a task for the school, for years to come, is to continue analyzing those institutes which have led to this centralization in comparison with the experience in other countries. Let us take as an example the reform of the judiciary in Spain after the death of Franco. What was done to restore the freedom of press, and when we're speaking about the alternative or independent mass media in Russia, these probably make up about 5 to 7% of the entire Russian media. That's about the volume that we're seeing in Russia today, which could be tentatively called as being in opposition to the Kremlin. So today's political regime, pursuing the purpose of its survival, is continuously trying to lower the intellectual level of the Russian society. This is achieved through several ways, including the utopic view of the imperial past of Russia, and alongside the mechanization of violence, which is an important topic in the context of trust, because a country with such a phenomenal heritage or legacy of violence, the problem of trust is more and more acute, and indeed we are seeing in Russia one of the lowest levels of trust between in interpersonal relations compared to other countries. Some of the international studies we have conducted, we have seen that the highest level of trust in interpersonal relations is seen in Scandinavian countries, as well as New Zealand, Switzerland, and Russia is among such as countries as Uruguay, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico. That is, countries which are going through very acute social conflict and strife. Countries with a very high conflict level. Poland is among these countries too, and some other post-communist states. So this is this very low level of trust is an indication and a reflection of underdeveloped or undeveloped social sphere and indeed infrastructure, which makes it impossible for whole segments, social segments in Russia to present and to draw attention to their problems, to the things which are of importance to them. As a compensation, we are seeing the propaganda of great power, the propaganda of the image of the great empire, militarism, and this is a compensatory mechanism which is unstable in itself. However, one cannot help decrying its importance and in terms of the success in the manipulation of the public mind. One should also take into account these processes in terms of the so-called failed democracy, to have the instruments and indeed to I have no doubt that in a historical perspective of, let us say, 5 to 8 years, Russia, that is us, will confront a host of problems, and being unprepared for understanding the nature of these problems and conflicts would really mean to erase all hope for change. And at this, I would like to stop. Thank you. Well, we shall go back and we will leave discussion to the end of the session. But if I may just ask one question. Looking back, looking at our history, one may understand what the government was pursuing in, say, the 1990s. And first it was really the struggle for power, and the resources were scarce. After the power was consolidated in the hands of a specific group, and we remember the history of this power struggle, it was really the point of control, of keeping the control, retaining the control, retaining the grip. So from this standpoint, this is understood. However, from the standpoint of the society, from the standpoint of the civil component in Russia, how really significant is this demand for a strong hand, this public call or the public penchant for the strong hand, let us say in the figure of Vladimir Putin. This may be a simplification. However, what I'm trying to ask is that to what extent was the Russian society in the second half of the 1990s, was it frightened? Was the Russian society scared to follow follow the path that the society seemed to have taken in the beginning of the 1990s? Well, I wouldn't say that. I think that the situation is a lot more complicated. And would require probably too much time for me to try and analyze. But what I may say is that the beginning of the first Chechen war, the first war in Chechnya, which indeed followed very soon after the shooting of the parliament, when the political discussion really degenerated into sheer force. I'm not trying to say why was this the case, and I'm not trying to give a judgment about the situation. However, in my view, this was the time when violence started to take place of the political discussion, and I would not be willing to decry that the government had very difficult times. However, the weakening of the democratic system required the support of the security forces, and indeed in the middle of the 1990s, Yeltsin was indeed and Mr. Yeltsin was certainly a very charismatic leader. Mr. Yeltsin was very much led, if not forced, to search his support in these siloviki, or the security related ministries and groups in Russia, and indeed the weakening support on the part of the society, which was indeed not and the degradation of the party system, because the parties indeed evolved in Russia as fragments or the shards of the nomenclatura, and they were not particularly representative for the Russian public. So this lowering of trust in politics led to the dramatic decline in the popularity of the then government, including Mr. Yeltsin, and the shift in the rhetoric towards this very conservative slant. And even before the advent of Mr. Putin, there was this shift towards the security-related organizations, ministries, agencies. At the same time, the reforms of the so-called administrative revolution of Vladimir Putin in the first years of his presidency, such as abolishing of local self-government and the administrative reform did cause some resentment. However, it was too late. It was way too late, and the Soviet experience of inertia, apathy, adaptation prevailed over the civic sentiment. And well, thank you very much. Thank you. So these were words, not diagnosis of Mr. Gudkov for the past 25 years of the Russian social and political history. However, the question really is if there are growth points for trust to grow in Russia. And these are the questions, indeed, that I would like to address to Andrey Kolesnikov. The almost apocalyptic times coming. One may have heard that the Russian patriarch Cyril has had an eschatological set of phrases. It's like an old Jewish joke. Do you trust the end of the world? And the answer is, well, I don't trust it, but I'm observing it. So the question really is how to get out of this deadlock. And what I will try to talk about is our study conducted together with the Levada Center and Carnegie Center in summer. We have had 12 questions, 12 queries in this poll, and we had 4 focus groups in July. And the liberals of different age groups, young and senior, and conservatives of 2 groups, young and senior. These words from an old songs of Boris Grebenshchikov dating back to 1996 show that the situation in Russia has not much changed. We are seeing the political and public discourse. It is amazing how Boris Grebenshchikov got this sentiment in his song. Do people wish to be salvaged, to be saved? And this is not an empty question. And the next question is, if they want to be saved, how they would like to be saved. Yes, people wish to be saved. This may be a result coming from this question. 41% are saying that we need change. Only 11% of those polled say that we don't need change. But when we go deep into the subtleties, the picture is not as clear. And we are seeing these on the example of focus groups. When people in the focus groups say that people wish change, but what kind of change? They want Stalin. They want Stalin to come back and shoot the bastards and bring the order back into the country. So out of these 42%, we may well see persons coming from vulnerable social segments, from regional Russian regions of Russia, and they live so poorly, they live so badly, they may live in abject poverty, which is indeed the cause of this populist Stalinism, a sentiment which is well seen in Russia. Yet again, there is this idea of dividing the property, nationalizing and dividing everything, which is, by the way, interestingly, not something which could be circumscribed to the left. No, you can hear such phrases even from the mouth of the Russian liberals. We are also seeing even the more educated among those polled are in favor of gradual change and two more groups have been singled out. One is the Muscovites, which are, one may say, more liberal. The Muscovites are generally in favor of the legal reform of the judiciary. However, the significant part of even the Muscovites are in favor of strong state interventionist model, which is generally a reflection of the ability of the state to fix our problems. And we're seeing our study shows that the most conservative group of our population, who are happy with everything, happy with Putin, is interestingly the age group between 18 to 24, which don't much think about how they're going to live in this country of Russia, and they're not particularly interested in change. And one may argue that how about the people who go for the rallies and streets? Yes, it's this also the young people, but it's the drastic minority. The main mass of the Russian young are not particularly favoring change. Do you wish change? The answer is yes. Are you going to do something to bring about the change? I'm not sure. Do you think the government will do anything for change? I don't think so. Are you ready to pay a price for any change? Not ready at all. So all of these makes change or reform a virtual impossibility, according to the polls we have conducted. This picture, this table is the social segmentation or the social profiling of those who may be needing change, including the middle class. I think it is clear from the table that representatives of the Russian bureaucracy, of the officers, of the oligarchs are not particularly interested in change. But the aims or the purposes of a change that people may be willing is that they wish to live better. They don't much need the healthcare reform, which is in a stark contrast with the people being disenchanted with the general state of the medical services. Interestingly, that agriculture and industry are among the top priorities for the development. Developing the industry, I suppose, heavy industry. It is also symptomatic to have the last line, which is the imperial or the great power status. We already live in a great power. We have already regained this right. Everything is fine. The great power status has been regained, and this is not something that we're in any way concerned about. You have done this. Now give us a better life. You gave us pride. You allowed us to regain the pride now, apart from the great powers status, people are also willing to live better, which of course brings us back to the subject of economy. Sorry for these somewhat muddled slides, but here in this table we can see that healthcare has gone up to the fourth line in these priorities, but the political rights the political rights, as we can see from this table, are very low in priority, whereas healthcare services, education, and material standard are among the top lines, and indeed, as you can see, the political rights or reducing the state intervention are very low in priorities, if significant at all. And indeed, the last line here is the broadening of the democratic rights and freedoms. That's an interesting slide. You may notice that the so-called reformers list are generally reflecting the electorate preferences, and we can see the general trust is quite low. The inertia induced question about Mr. Putin is that we have had 30 years of Mr. Zhirinovsky and Mr. Zyuganov and about 18 years of Mr. Putin. So this triad of the gold, silver, and bronze medalists are well represented in this graph. People in Moscow are saying that Putin will stay forever, and one should not be particularly interested in reform, and people of all political convictions are generally sure that he is not going to bring about any reform. It is also symptomatic that we are seeing Mr. Shoigu and Mr. Lavrov in this table, and Mr. Navalny is having 2% in across the country and about 5% in Moscow.
And I should say that cities with at least 500,000 people turn out to be more liberal, surprisingly, and those who are well disposed towards Navalny, not Moscow alone. His now face is recognized across the country, and if the power has made a mistake, made him a legitimate candidate, the votes of all those who are keen on voting for somebody who is not popular, then they would be moved away. Kadyrov is now ahead of all people who are in for reforms. This just gets a realistic ideas of people, of those who are carrying out reforms. He's known little or talk about reforms, mostly elitish. Kudrin's program, and Kadyrov is much more popular than him, and they think about some publications which are read only by the specialist audience among the very advanced readership. We're not focus groups. You recall the people that we have Kudrin and anybody. There are all kinds of attitudes. They say he's a good economist, he may do something. No, Kudrin is very close to Putin, therefore he will never do anything. And I remember that Kudrin has to do with Chubais. It means they will steal the budget. I've heard that Putin invested our money into some American treasuries, so he works for the Americans. So this is the main thing, that he is the person who wrote a roadmap for salvation and is all ready to present it. And Glaziev, it is not a complete picture, of course, but there are others, other kind of people who go for reform. Their names are listed lower, and this was done by, who's Bagdasarov? Who are all those people? He's just talking head. He's a person who is moderating a talk show. All those people who shout on live, they are what people think are reform, who pursue the reforms. So what is the price we are prepared to pay for the reforms? Well, this is just, there's maybe one of the select reforms, so raising no, we don't want people retire later. We don't want to get rid of social well-being reforms, co-payments. Well, for medical care, for education, people are not well prepared for that, although in Moscow people will be more heard about this, such things that you will pay a little and the state will pay and they will really provide you good medical care. Well, across the country, it's seen in a very different way. Shutting down the non-viable businesses, people got more or less calm about that. But those who are ready to undertake new technology, look, that much is that this is like iPhone 7. We are all prepared for that, no big deal. If you look into in detail who is best prepared, mostly people who are unemployed, they haven't got much to do and they are ready to go and get new gadgets. A slide I forgot to put up in my presentation is very important. Where do you think are the ways to the instruments and the tools for change? Despite a very much discredited institution of elections. People say elections, yes, this is a chief instrument of change. 43% say that election is the way to go. It's clear that 30% find it hard to come up with an answer, but election, whatever, election. And people repeatedly say are still positive about this. And pretty young people, like who are now 29 to 39, have high income and good education. They go online every day. They are very hard positions. Strangers at myself, I don't know why they don't show up at election. They don't turn out at election. But this is the way they see the change. Going that way, like within 12 to 16 to 20, 21%, they are all who subscribe to some kinds of petitions, take part in volunteer organizations. For that matter, volunteerism in the civic sense of the word really Moscow has been by far much ahead of the country. I think that everybody is so keen of bureaucracy and people now saw the good effect of taking part in, say, those who are champions to prevent some new construction in their yards. They go for protest and they realize they can influence that and they can take part in municipal election. So Moscow is now very well adopting this instrument of change, but it seems to me that this is just Moscow for us. Out of all things you shared with us, I will ask you a very naive question. Maybe this is exactly like thinking what our future holds for us. This is maybe our future. This is what we see. We built a huge, great power. We are good about this. Now the state will now take care of us all. Maybe this is the way to go. Well, I believe, yes, exactly. Kudrin's program, I believe, is all written following that logic and the logic of realistic approach towards possible minor changes, which actually extend not so much the way towards country's transformation, literally, but rather they extend the life expectancy to this regime that is not that much effective. But they're not interested. None of these people want a revolution, with the exception with the absolutely disadvantaged who don't care about. They have nothing to lose. This is maybe the main demand that the society has for the government, and the government will not be eternal, but if they pursue just minor change in economy and will continue with this somewhere near zero, maybe this is almost mass demand for that, maybe somewhat paternalistic. Lev Dmitrievich mentioned a study by Yuri Levata. When we ran that study, we looked up his old articles, Denis and I, where you can very well see that, like in the early 1990s, gradually, 1995, 1999, you see rising paternalist expectations. First, everybody wants to start their own business. They want to go and vote and whatever. But then they say, well, let somebody do it for us. Let somebody find a job for us. Okay, I'll have less money, but I'll be more secure with my job. So this trend, it's like, it goes back 20 years. So this tactics and strategy of Putin may well work. It be quite viable and long-living. It reminds me of a Francoist regime that was like falling to pieces but never fell, could never die. And they were even minor improvements, very much like near Putin, very much like in Franco's time. Near Franco, they were almost liberals, almost technocrats, although they had like ultra-right fascists. We've got a lot near Putin of this kind too. But this way or other, Spain was going on ahead. There was a joke like in the late 1960s when Franco was very much like the age our leader is now in. What is Franco mostly doing? He's sitting in his room and two folders ahead of him on his desk. Like in one it says it's problems that time took care of and problems that time will take care of. So he's just shifting documents from one folder to another. We don't see major catastrophe or disaster hitting us. So this is our road map for salvation, and that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, Maxim Trudolyubov. Now he has to finish this session. We'll have a Q&A and discussion. We'll have some time left for that. Maxim, you now have the floor, please. The floor is yours. Dear friends, good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you because of the anniversary of this school. I would like to, again, and I apologize for that, to shift the focus of my presentation to sort of scale up, looking from a higher perspective, like from a distance. Not look at Russia alone, but look at the processes underway now in the world as a whole. And that gives a very ample opportunity to just make fantasizing, because there is so much less data, but we've mostly got this impression that where there matters of trust or lack of trust for these just personal feelings. Well, we live now through major discomfort. We, meaning the society that is worrying about humanistic, liberal values, and we go through this discomfort or maybe crisis. And Russia is not alone here, far from that. And I would like to get to understand this perception. Yuri Petrovich spoke about this in beautiful words. I'd like to get back to these values. Many of these values were crystallized in the epoch of the Enlightenment and then were politically implemented, or in part were realized in the 20th century. That is, the possibility to realize or to implement and to embody these humanistic values. Belief in man, belief in sacred nature of life, the possibility to defend an individual from illegal persecution, unlawful, persecution, value of freedom and protecting property, they in most part to the peak, and that was when it was lived in political sense of the word, of course. It happened in the post-war years. The values were long ago formulated. They had existed for quite a while and were enshrined in the constitutions in many countries. But at the international level, it all is becoming a reality, a tangible reality, after the Second World War. The impulse for that, in many ways, had to do with a very acute, deep-rooted feeling to avoid, never to allow a world tragedy like the Second World War ever happen again. I wanted to draw attention to that. This embodiment of humanistic values, this possibility to do it, always demands, like any, it has to do with a number of political conditions, very much down to earth and practical conditions that need to exist, but they're not always there. So in the post-war West, so to say, that became possible. And one of the impulses for that was this standoff of the two then existing poles of the world. That was the Soviet Union and the United States, who tried to contain each other, to control each other, not to allow the other part to get to grab new political stands. And this led to, necessarily, it led to compromises between the two. I feel that nowadays, when we spoke about the 100 years anniversary of the Soviet Union, not so much of the Soviet Union as 100 years since the revolution, which ended in 1991, we didn't always note exactly the footprint of the Soviet Union it left in the world. This communist project, which was embodied, sort of was very much realized in the world, and we are looking at how it was implemented. It really probably enjoys a kind of influence that is peerless, and it gave rise to many political processes too, to many political projects in the world. To begin with, fascist projects, fascist countries and states in many ways were an answer to the socialist project. They wanted to set up a new state that would never allow this class internationalism, and instead would find something to oppose it, like interests of the nation, interests of the corporations, the strength, the power, sport, and values like this. Well, had it not been for the Soviet Union, history of Italy, Germany, Hungary, Poland, and many other countries would be very, very different from what it was. This was a negative answer, but there was a positive answer to that, as again, getting away from how much these values manifested themselves in defending people, what is known people who were working people. Many people abroad, they perceived this as something that materialized at this tectonic shift in protecting the working people's interests from people living elsewhere, very selectively, maybe to some of the voters. They thought it was really something that did take place in Soviet Union, and that's why the Western politicians had to come up with something in response to that. That is why the Soviet project had played such an important role in this welfare state that rose in the West, that sought to bring together the values of capitalism as well as securing the working people's interests. Well, speaking about values level, again, by the end of the war, even the Vatican, the Holy See, made very important shifts in its position and its attitude towards values. And hence, it gave rise to this word combination, human rights, that were uttered by the then Pope Pius XII, who sought to make a very tricky political step, never to give way to, without amending in a radical way the position of the Church towards socialism, where it completely denied socialism and refused to accept it as something good, up to complete rejection of those Catholics who would join the communist parties in their countries, up to excommunicating them from the Church. But on the other hand, to take some step saying that the Church is prepared to take into account the rights of individuals, including working people's rights, seeking to reconciliate it. It looked very much like convergence. On that side, we saw the movement at the values level that was ready to recognize in part those values that, in their perception, sort of were ostensible, as they thought, the Soviet project was securing. For this reason, in some reflected way, like a mirror, that is why the Soviet project played such a vast role in promoting in movement towards humanistic values in the West. Again, promotion of education, especially technical education, engineering, in the West in many ways, it was dictated by their desire to compete with what was at that time seen as huge success achieved by the Soviet Union in space exploration and engineering, in industrial construction. In this way, it seems to me, I would like to show that securing these values, which we now call universal values or universalistic values, in many ways it was made possible because of historic, just because it so happened. Because in that world there were two centers of power, Soviet and capitalistic, embodied by America. And what we witness nowadays is just ongoing process of the disintegration of this off-stand, which originally, the very first step was taken by the Soviet Union, which just sort of self-dissolved. And there is Ponce waves, they are just taking place right now, the second pole of the world, following a very different scenario, but in point of fact has been gradually disintegrating, stopping to exist in the way it existed in response to the Soviet Union. Well, from this values perspective, what has happened to us? What happened to us was that because of these naturally subsided opposition and standoff, our society in Russia, together with the Russian state rather, led and foremost by the state, left this field, which may be, called with some reservations, the field of human rights, when you want to defend individual interests, life, freedom, and property, going above the borders, as it was seen by those who drafted the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, as it was seen by those political figures who stood behind founding the international organizations in the late 1940s and early 1950s. We are now moving in a natural way away from that area of focus on individuality towards focus on collective ways of gratification in search of identity, be it national identity, ethnic identity. Actually they are placing this identity as ethnic affiliation as part of a religious group we belong to, or ethnic group we belong to. And if we are prepared to search for our gratification in that or by that, through that, it will necessarily and inevitably be collective. And it is above and takes precedence over individual, over the values of individual life, individual freedom, or even property, as we can see in the example of Russia. But it is not something happening to Russia alone. In the last several years, for quite a while, we can see very much the same collective gratification when we want to meet the demands of the collective. I, as part of my nation, I, as part of my religious community, stands above the individual demands. It is seen in Europe too, this way, for example, in Hungary, in Poland, and even in the United States. Considerable portion of society in America is now divided. It is a divided nation at this time. Now stands for the values of, so to say, in reply to the something that was dominant in the times before, that were internalistic values. So they are very major tectonic shifts and change that does not affect Russia alone. Far from that. Again, what has happened? This process of globalization, as we saw it in post-war times, as it was evolving then, following the impulses that were caused by their design to never again allow this global disaster from the globalization in the form it was seen then. I suppose it is over now. Globalization based on large, big trade agreements, for example, based on big international institutions. These processes are now living through crisis, and certainly I would never try to project or predict how they would develop any further. But it's hard to imagine right now, in this world, the return to global trade agreements. It's hard to imagine the large supranational institutions getting stronger. But does that mean that the values of freedom, defending human lives and freedom and property, they have lost all sense? And does it mean that the processes that are really globally happening, that somebody can prevent us as free people, prevent us from thinking? Does it mean that an individuality, because man is individual rather than part of the team and collective, will soon be left totally unprotected and would lose the institutions that once were set up to protect the interests of individuals rather than ethnic or religious communities? I don't believe that is the case. In answer to all these questions, the answer would be no. It would be no. These values have never lost their appeal or their sense, or any obstacles that could prevent us from thinking freely. These obstacles are not there. And again, the most difficult thing is values of an individual as in opposition to the interests of the community, religious or ethnic community. But I believe in this area too, in point of fact, there are no reasons to be too pessimistic here. What has been going on right now is the crisis of institutions, as well as the crisis of political entities that shaped up just astride this post-war wave, or during the standoff of the Soviet Union and the Western world. That crisis, yes, indeed there, it is profound, and it may well be that indeed it might lead to very substantial change in political image, sort of, or political shape of the world, especially in the Western countries. But it does not at all mean that the values per se have lost their importance. No. I think that as we go through this, our perception of the crisis, as we try to perceive it, the crisis of humanistic values, we should make a distinction between really existing problems that are there, and we make a dividing line from frustration in our feelings that have to do with discomfort, when we left this comfort zone. That for those people who have these liberal humanistic values, for many years they have been living under the spell of illusion that there are super strong entities and structures in the world who stand for these values. I suppose we should part with this illusion. Part with it, and there will be no big deal. It's not a disaster in itself. Moreover, these entities, for that matter, are alive and are working. It may well be that for most part this perception is exactly the perception rather than a reality. Nevertheless, the real political problems do exist, and I think that this ability to make a distinction between the really existing political problems and this discontent and frustration caused by our leaving the comfort zone. That's it. And again, let's recall that the very possibility of political embodiment of these, when we seek to defend universal values in post-war times, they were caused by the coincidence of several political factors, quite real factors in real politics at the time. Otherwise it would never have happened. In the same way, for the future, things would happen which with time will turn the process backwards. Again, looking into the search for compromise rather than searching for dividing lines, as is something we are witnessing today. We are today seeing very active process of drawing dividing lines of those who carry internationalistic values, liberal values, and values of defending the national identity, religious identity, and ethnic identity. We see them diverging right now, and it is something that we see in politics, in political life of almost every country we keep watching on in the news. We are now living through this phase, but the world is developing, and we will then reach another wave of when we will be looking for compromise. Thank you.
Maxim, thank you. If I may just ask for some specification for this time that you have mentioned. Do you believe that there will be no change between there comes some moment of truth in the relations between the strong in this world? Well, in a way, I'm not willing to cast any prognosis, but when we look at the global situation, the defense of the internationalist values, the supernatural values, or the universal values, if you will, are of interest to China, interestingly. Probably less so to America or the West, which is no longer a consolidated entity. That's an interesting point. This is not to say that we can look for some optimism in terms of humanitarian values, but interestingly, this is a specific story. Today, when this surrealist times of Russia-US confrontation in the virtual space ceases, which I hope it does. It's some sort of a conflict where the bullets and cannonballs actually fly in the virtual space, and against this background we can see a tremendous geopolitical success of China, because we are seeing that America is gradually leaving or voiding many regions in the world. Colleagues, this is indeed we have had some very interesting presentations, and I call you to express opinions or ask questions. Georgy Chizhov from the Ukraine. It happens so that this session is in a way related to social science or sociology. But there's a question that I would like to ask. Sociology often deals with forecasts, and while we know that we share the views that do what you must and be as it may. However, what are we to expect from the future of our civilization? We may be willing to stand or stop in our tracks and try to see, is it really the nearing end of the world that we're seeing, or is this some sort of the low and the high points of a sinusoid, a sinus curve, which may be just some sort of a contrary point to the Fukuyama's point proclaimed in the early years of this school's history. And can we really foresee in any credible way the future of and what are we to expect? Well, I think that Maxim has tried his best to give his forecast. Maybe, I think that Maxim's deliberation may have even put this question in a more acute form. Well, I think that the end of the world and the end of history is a recurrent event, and the history starts anew. I think that the end of history was way before Fukuyama, was the pre-World War I period when the globalization, the first wave of globalization, was sweeping across the world, and there was even a phrase at that time that a common English person may only have to come into interaction with the state at the post office. However, this first end of history ended at a very dramatic note of World War I. And in a way, we're seeing a similar situation. I don't think that the so-called populist regimes, including their leaders, are in any significant way different in terms of their strategy, tactics, or indeed even a discourse are particularly different from the leaders in the 1920s or the 1930s, which were proto-fascist or indeed fascist parties. In terms of populism, I may be giving it a very exacerbated slant, but this is what I think. Armen Zakarian from Armenia, from the Yerevan school. Let me thank all of our presenters for very interesting expert presentations. But my question is to Mr. Gudkov. Leonid Dmitrievich, you ended with a statement that in the next 5 to 8 years we may see new problems coming or mounting in Russia, while the problems which can be seen in Russia are even profiled higher in my country, in Armenian. Could you just be more specific with respect to the problems that you believe may be mounting in Russia in the next 5 to 8 years? Thank you. Well, even today we can see the depletion of Mr. Putin's system of government. This crisis started even before the oil prices went down. This crisis started at prices over $100 per barrel. The huge expenses, the enormous expenses on the defense budget and the security-related sphere undermine the economy of Russia, cause higher distrust, lead to depletion of investments, or indeed the investments running dry. The external conditions are such that this government is conducting confrontational foreign policies, which are in turn causing sanctions on the part of many governments and states. Well, the population will continue to there's a long way to go to the critical mass. However, the tension in the social sphere is being already seen in the middle and upper echelons of the bureaucracy. The actual mobility problems, conflict of interests, the lack of social lifts, feuds between the different clans and influence groups. So sooner or later, this will necessitate a shift in government and a physical retirement, which in terms will exacerbate the struggle for power, which was something that we saw in post-Stalin times during the demotion of Nikita Khrushchev. This was something that we also saw in the latter years of Gorbachev's period. So we will see a whole set of systemic problems which will, which this regime, this government will not be able to resolve. As indeed its tactics, as I already said, is the gradual simplification of the social discourse and indeed lowering of the intellectual levels. It is betting on the force, it's betting on power, which really doesn't solve problems. So situations of crisis are inevitable, and the fact that the economy is not moving forward is I'm not in favor of economic determinism, which is probably more of a sign of stagnation, but the negative selection into the government, the bans for political parties, because we're actually living in the environment of a single political party, the mounting social troubles. These are indeed symptoms of crisis. The off-the-system populists like Mr. Navalny or some others who are also indicative of the political system. And in addition, we're seeing the tensions rising in the middle echelon of the bureaucracy and the middle tier of the bureaucracy, because the Russian bureaucracy virtually has to put up and to listen to the concerns of the population, and they have to find a compromise with the upper tier of the government. However, this path for this report with the government is now blocked. The breakup of the Soviet system, one of the causes of the breakup of the Soviet system was exactly at this juncture. I always quote very persuasive statistics. In the end of Stalin's time, under mass terror, 3 years was the time for the bureaucrat to be in office. In the end of Brezhnev's time, the term of being in office was around 21 years. So the bureaucracy was indeed one of the locomotives of change in the end of the Soviet times. So I'm not trying to say that this will happen in exactly the same way, but I think that this tension in the mid tiers of bureaucracy are indicative of these tensions. Svetlana Shmelyov from the Moscow School. I don't have a specific question to ask, but I would like to impart my personal opinion, and I will try to make this by asking three statements, or making three statements. To what extent are events in the globalized world isolated? Or can we say that such phenomena as lowering freedoms, the hybrid regimes are becoming more and more common across the world? Can we say can we at all talk about the uniformity of such political tendencies? And secondly, can we in any way deliberate about collective paths towards salvation, as indeed we thought that globalization would lead to a more uniform nature of things? And do you believe that there are some collective vectors of the global development, or else you think that reformation or enlightenment is only possible on the individual level? We remembered related to the harmony between the individualistic and the collective approach, and given that the world is made up of minorities, do you believe that this lack of demand for change may be related to the subtleties of relationship between revolution and evolution? Well, evolution, revolution, and involution, these are all concepts to be considered. Alexander Rubtsov once spoke, characterizing the Russian system of government is the upwards developing dumbwaiter. So the theory of regimes is evolving. Everything is hybrid. The political regimes are hybrid, and the war is hybrid. That's a term that has been introduced, although I once used the term of hybrid war. Dmitry Trenin said to me, please take this phrase away, because the wars have always been hybrid. In the 19th century, in the early 20th century, there were information wars, and a war had always been a hybrid phenomenon. We're just trying to make up new words which really describe things that we have seen many times. There is a trend. I can't say that if it's a global trend. I don't think that we can be making any judgments about the true globalized nature of such political trends. Well, it is true that we have this concept of the totality of minorities, or the world as a totality of minorities. This is a concept that has long been proposed, and there is this I think that the developments in the world today will mainly be determined by the counteraction or the struggle between the populist and anti-populist movements.
School. I just wanted to thank you all for your inspiring thoughts, but basically I think I haven't heard much about road to salvation. I heard much more about road to further deterioration, or maybe further, catastrophe. I'm not into these theories of catastrophe, but in any case, I just wanted to ask you, is it a time that we kind of change our struggle methods in this framework that we are all living in of democracy as we know it? Because we do see, I maybe disagree or agree with you, we do see similar tendencies in different variations in the world today. You have your own specific context in Russia, but for example, Croatia, as the newest EU member, faces the same illiberal tendencies as Poland is at the moment. We won't talk again about Brexits and Trumps and things like that. So basically, is this civic sector or people who are fighting for this thing called liberal democracies are able at the moment, and how change their own concepts and their own way of struggle? Thanks. Whoever wants to answer.
Well, I guess just road to salvation is just not that easy, and some bumps are absolutely natural on the way.
Мы что-нибудь скажем? Я предлагаю нам, на самом деле, да, если можно, Максим.
Could we react to this? Because Maxim, yes, please. Well, I understand your concern. the roadmap to salvation could hardly proceed from this meeting, and even if we had agreed to what exactly are we supposed to save and what is it that we want to save, if we move, I think that the values of individual life, of individual freedoms is what I personally am most interested in as the precious object of salvation. If we believe that this is what we should be attempting to save, then I think that these values still have a bright future, except that their protection, it was in a way upheld by several organizations and structures of supernatural level, which in a way are in crisis. Protecting these individual liberties and freedoms across borders, which indeed what we saw after World War II as the emerging ideology of human rights and the protection of human rights and the protection of human life, irrespective of the fact where does this particular human reside, that is, irrespective of the political and geographical borders. Now we are in a somewhat different situation when there are communities in the world which are saying that national borders are a lot more important to secure freedoms than some transfrontier, transborder, supernatural institutions, supranational institutions and agreements. So it is this conflict or tension that exists between these waves, the wave of populism and counter-populism. And I'm pretty sure that there will be this movement against populism, which we will see in the West, in my view, as early as in 4 to 5 years during the next political cycle. So I think that there are a lot of room for optimism because these values have not gone away. They are with us, and I think that they will be held preciously. Thank you very much. I'm Valerial Chebotaru, coming from the Moldovan school, from Moldova. Thank you for inviting me. I have a question to the panelists, which may come from the Huntington's approach, Samuel Huntington's approach to the clash of civilizations. What is do you think is the public view in Russia with respect to the post-Soviet countries? Or the so-called post-imperialist mentality. What is the concept of the Russian world? Is there such a thing as or a desire on the part of the Russian public and political mind to find itself or find its identity? How are we supposed to take to this? And indeed, do you believe that the government of Mr. Putin and this public mind, with respect to, say, in terms of the view of the future of the so-called near abroad, like Georgia, Moldova, the Ukraine, how is it viewed in the public mind? Maybe this may be a question to Mr. Gudkov. Because what is the potential here? Can we formulate something in post-imperialist terms? What could we do to build a model of coexistence?
Well, mass conscience is pretty tolerant. Otherwise, the right word to see is indifferent and patient intolerant about whatever happens beyond Russia. The Russian society is a tired society. It's a society tired of all conflicts and is not prepared to support any whatsoever actions, spontaneous actions. That is why we see that in order to justify any use of force, one has to employ very effective propaganda. When in November 13, 75% were against intervention into Ukrainian affairs. When the Maidan started, one had to start a propaganda campaign by naming whatever was happening in Ukraine as Nazism, fascism, so that they could really incite this sort of hostility towards Ukraine. That is why this is where all these ideological structures of the Russian world and others, they do not work on one's conscience unless special and very powerful efforts are made in propaganda. And trust me, they are. I'd like to say that in all responsibility that propaganda is extremely effectively using the novel technologies, not only psychological, political and others. It is a very powerful weapon. What is it that is changing? Well, the first wave of aggression towards the neighbors, that is the former Soviet republics, rose exactly when the Baltic countries and then Georgia later on began to integrate with the European Union. And when the first wave started in 2003 and 2004, again on the very same grounds that in the Baltic countries they are seeing the revival of Nazism and revanchism and whatever. And that is why the image of an enemy, it has been undergoing change. It's clear that the United States, with the advent of Putin, became arch enemy, but then it's either Georgian countries, then Baltics and then Georgia. But pretty fast after the propaganda ended, it completely erased all kinds of anti-Georgian sentiment at the historical lowest. Although they were number two, now Ukraine. Whatever is happening in Moldavia does not fall into the information field. It's not on television, so there's no mobilization or hatred or whatever. Poland, yes, was there then at a time, at a certain time. Now it's, of course, Ukraine. It's something very sustainable and will stay for long. But the purpose is not so much to show any aggression towards Ukraine, rather than with some hindsight to discredit people who are all for liberal reform within Russia, domestic. Discreditation of idea of change, when like the fifth column or foreign agents, because this immediately is linked to the activity of CIA, Pentagon, and the United States and whatever. There is no such mass hostility. No, it will not be seen. Isolationism has been rising, that for sure. That is why ideological concepts are really something from the top-down approach. They do not live long. They're very rapidly changing because they have no base like in the public. But to reanimate them, yes. And in a sense that in some way or other they are reviving Brezhnev's doctrine about Russia's right to influence the neighbors, immediate neighbors. Colleagues, I think we have time for two more questions, but then we will catch up because we'll have 2 hours to go. So, and I suppose at that we would stop so that we could continue within an hour. Kirill Oreshkin, an alumnus of the Moscow School from Lithuania. Maxim Trudolyubov was saying about the positive, amongst other things, a positive effect of the Soviet Union onto Western society in building social state there was also another important influence, that is the influence of that was giving rise to consolidation in terms of values of the West on this standoff with the Soviet Union, when the ideas of socialist ideas, especially in their, like for export, were pretty attractive, and for the Western intelligentsia too. So that is why ideological standoff, as I see it, was actually causing this sort of consolidation of the Western universal values. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, this pole disintegrated, and this consolidating factor disappeared, went away. But in point of fact, you are saying that Russia is conducting an ideological war. And I would not say it is a hybrid war, but it's surely ideological. And in point of fact, and you can think it is a second Cold War, but the thing is that in this Cold War, so far Russia alone is taking part in that. The West, in my view, is not reflecting that the Cold War has started. It's time to wage it, it's time to oppose ideologically Russia to Russia, and maybe this acknowledgement, this recognition of the fact that the Cold War is on us, this is something that could again become something that would bring together the West and to consolidate the values again. Yes, thank you, Kirill. Indeed, I think that you see that the Cold War, and you see, is on, but there is a great disagreement because many people in the West deliberately do not want to call it that way, just because following the logic that it's too much of an honor. Why should we allocate too much additional energy to this? And this is the explanation, as far as I see it, the refusal to recognize by any deliberate ideological impulse on Russia against the West. And there is some sense, it makes sense in some logic. You see that Russian elites are the top that comes up with the some ideas, because all that is not really something coming from the society, like bottom up. It's top down when they try to make this opposition between Russia and the Western world. And Russia now is something that stands for traditional values, for collective values. It is, amongst other things, ethnic and religious. Whatever, you can see the notes, hear the notes of even American conservatives and evangelists at times, where they seek to attempt to put on the agenda to put it into Russian politics. I believe that doesn't really work. Many people realize that it is a very much top-down, something very artificially constructed conservatism, and Putin or Putin's milieu wants to see Russia as the pillar of conservatism. This is their pet idea, but it is very far from reality. Look at the real Russian society, how religious it is, how much traditional it is. It's one of the most modernized societies in the world, and in small families, in absolute freedom, and in real social liberalism. And if Russian people in Russia, you tell them that they're liberal, they will be surprised, because they live this life. And yes, indeed, when they ask them questions, they say, yes, we are Orthodox, yes. But at that, most of them don't believe in God, they don't go to church. So what we have a mass of strange things. And apart from that, as I'm wrapping up, I'm sorry I'm speaking so long, is that in many ways, and this gives the explanation, pretty serious attitude towards Russia, in the sense that many people in the world realize that it's something very artificial. But having said that, we should point out that, on a global note, if I may finish on that, what I wanted to say is that Russia, given a certain viewpoint, is a catalyzer of global change, which was the case in the 20th century. Had it not been for the Soviet project, no political projects in the world would have existed, be they good or bad. Now Russia, in a certain way, catalyzes global change. In many societies in the world, they can see it's not that they are being distracted from what we are in reality. In Russia, they see some things in us which we're not. Hearing the so-called political leadership in many countries of Europe, it is thought that Putin is such a tough leader, and we don't have a leader like that, all kinds of softies. So it's like they see the defense of political and ethnic values. They see it through their own filter, but I'm sure in the next political way we will see an answer to that. All societies are heterogeneous, and there are other different interests in that, and today's wave will subside when people are all carried away with this ethnic and some kind of local parochial identification. They would give rise to another wave, something very different.
John Lloyd from the school. I just want to echo others who have said this was three extraordinarily stimulating and thoughtful presentations. It was mainly for Andrey that I wanted to ask, and to see if I had the correct impression. At the end of your presentation, you agreed with Mikhail that it was likely that Putin or Putinism would be successful. And I wanted to make sure I understood why you thought so. Is it because he is quite charismatic, because he has made the country more powerful, and that it's likely, people think, that he will make life better? Are these the main elements, or are there others?
In point of fact, my honest answer would be I don't know what Putinism, how effective that is. It is some kind of original sort of effectiveness. We speak when the end comes of this phenomenon. We don't want to focus on personalities here. Let's focus on the phenomenon. Very many people nowadays ask a question whether will Putinism survive Putin per se. If, say, Putin goes away, does it mean democracy will immediately follow, competitive economy and competitive politics? It's a big question, and nobody gives an answer or knows the answer to that. But it remains a fact, in this state of depression, with the economy nearing zero growth, with very low social expectations, with simplification of these expectations, when we see lowering of the standards, what is known as Lev Dmitrich has been saying, with negative identification, with negative adaptation. Things have gone worse, yes, that is the case, but okay, we will survive. They are again attacking us, but based upon that, not because we are a good, positive idea, but we are together because they are attacking us, and we trust the commander of our besieged fortress. It is surprising how much staying power these quasi sort of institutions of a besieged fortress, how good they are at surviving of this negative identification. It seems it works, and even the Crimea, many people think the effect of Crimea has been exhausted. To my mind, quite the opposite. It's constant, it's a routine. Of course, this emotional euphoria is gone, for sure, but the most recent data by Levada Center say that Crimea was supported by 70%, by now 74%. It's a huge number, very serious figure to my view. That is why the resolve may be running out, but nobody can say responsibly that yes, we keep waiting when it will run away, but it will not go away, it will not vanish. I am afraid there is no adequate answer to when it would go away, what would help this regime to stay longer, and when we transit from something bad towards something softer and better? That is a big question. To my mind, the next presidential period, it's not a period of transit towards democracy, regrettably. It is, at best, preparation for some kind of transit. Thank you very much. Actually, I'm keen to answer this question. I want to continue what Andrey has just said. I'm sorry, we will be just... we will return towards that in an hour. The question is that for those 2 hours we spoke about the future, about the roadmap, in the context of Russia and in the broader sense of the word. Recently I realized that I was thinking that I don't have this shape of things to come in my mind, this image. When they ask me when this regime, today's regime is over, what happens next? Okay, they will switch off the light, what happens next? I don't know, there's darkness. And this is what, I don't know, maybe brings me together with Vladimir Putin, democracy, bureaucracy. We are very helpless towards the future that is waiting on us. It is on the one hand some national consensus, we realize that we don't understand what is going on, but on the other hand it's just something to lean on for the government, so that we could, because we must again retain the status quo. But I believe that discussion we've had today, we don't know the answer to that question, but at least we tried to look into it, and this attempt in a way was a success.